Wicked billionaire husband pushed wife out of hot air balloon because she farted. But she survived and did this. What happens when a billionaire's cruelty pushes his innocent wife to the brink of death? But she returns stronger, determined for justice. You won't believe how it ends. Justice, strength, and unexpected twists await. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more gripping stories like this. Sarah Mitchell never imagined her life would end with a hot air balloon basket 1,000 feet above Napa Valley. But that's exactly what happened when her billionaire husband, Marcus, decided her most embarrassing moment deserved the death penalty. What she did next will leave you speechless. Survival and the most shocking revenge you've ever heard to reclaim everything that was stolen from her. Make sure you stay until the end because the twist will blow your mind. Sarah had always been ordinary. Growing up on a small farm in Iowa, she worked at the local farmer's market just to help her family pay bills on their modest farmhouse. Her dreams were simple. Find someone who loved her, maybe start a family, live quietly without the constant worry about money. She never expected to catch the attention of someone like Marcus Blackwell. Marcus wasn't just wealthy, he was obscenely rich. The kind of rich that bought politicians and owned entire industries. When he rolled into her sleepy hometown that summer morning, everything changed. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. His eyes locked onto Sarah immediately at the farmer's market where she was selling her grandmother's preserves. "What's your name, beautiful?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk, but with an undertone that should have been her first warning. Their courtship was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as romance. Marcus showered Sarah with gifts she'd never dreamed of owning. Designer dresses that cost more than her family made in a year. Jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight. Weekend trips to cities she'd only seen in movies. To Sarah, it felt like a fairy tale. To Marcus, it was an investment. He was buying her trust, her dependence, and most importantly, her isolation from everyone who might protect her. Sarah's family had their reservations, of course. Her father, a weathered farmer with calloused hands and sharp instincts, didn't trust Marcus from the beginning. There was something about the way Marcus looked at Sarah, like she was a prize to be won rather than a person to be loved. But Sarah was 24, independent, and completely swept off her feet. When Marcus proposed with a diamond the size of a grape, surrounded by 100 white roses on the beach in Malibu, she said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and nothing she truly wanted. Marcus insisted on flying in guests from around the world, hiring the most expensive planners and turning what should have been an intimate celebration into a media spectacle. 300 guests, most of whom Sarah had never met, watched as she walked down an aisle scattered with imported rose petals that cost more than most people's cars. The whole event was featured in luxury lifestyle magazines, with Marcus making sure every photographer captured his beautiful new acquisition. But even on their wedding day, there were signs. Small moments that Sarah's brain tried to dismiss but her heart couldn't quite ignore. The way Marcus gripped her wrist a little too tightly during photos when she tried to adjust her dress. The cold look in his eyes when her maid of honor made a joke during her speech. The way he spoke to the staff, as if they were objects rather than people. Sarah told herself these were just wedding day nerves, that once they settled into married life, Marcus would relax and show her the gentle man she'd fallen in love with. The honeymoon in the Maldives should have been perfect. Private overwater villa, crystal clear lagoons, sunsets that looked like paintings. But Marcus spent most of his time on business calls, leaving Sarah alone for hours while he screamed at employees halfway around the world. When she gently suggested they spend more time together, he exploded in a rage that left her trembling. It was the first time she saw the real Marcus, the man behind the charming facade. But it wouldn't be the last. Moving into Marcus's Malibu mansion felt like stepping into a beautiful prison. The house was stunning, all glass and marble and infinity pools that seemed to blend into the ocean horizon. But it was also cold, sterile, and completely isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, hidden behind gates and security systems. Sarah realized with growing unease that she couldn't just walk to a coffee shop or visit a friend. Everything required Marcus's permission, Marcus's driver, Marcus's approval. At first, Marcus's control was subtle. He'd suggest that Sarah's old friends from Iowa were beneath her now, that she needed to make connections with people in their social circle. He'd buy her expensive clothes but criticize her choices when she tried to dress herself. He'd plan elaborate dinner parties but then humiliate her in front of guests by correcting how she held her wine glass or spoke to the staff. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together they formed a web that slowly strangled Sarah's confidence and independence. The physical abuse started 6 months after their wedding. Sarah had suggested they visit her family for Christmas, and Marcus's response was swift and brutal. A backhand across her face that sent her sprawling across their marble kitchen floor. As Sarah lay there, tasting blood and fighting back tears, Marcus stood over her with a look of disgust rather than remorse. He told her that her family was embarrassing, that she was embarrassing, and that if she ever suggested such a thing again, the consequences would be far worse. That night, as Sarah held ice to her swollen cheek and stared at her reflection in their bathroom mirror, she made her first attempt to reach out for help. She called her sister Emma back in Iowa, but when Emma answered, Sarah found herself making excuses. She'd fallen down the stairs, she said. It was just a clumsy accident. The shame and embarrassment felt almost worse than the physical pain. How could she admit that her fairy tale marriage was actually a nightmare? How could she tell her family that the man they'd watched her marry on television was a monster? Marcus was clever about the abuse. He never hit her anywhere that would show when she wore the designer gowns he insisted she model at social events. He was careful to maintain his image as the devoted husband, always touching her arm possessively at parties, calling her his angel in front of others. To the outside world, they were the perfect power couple. Inside their fortress of a home, Sarah lived in constant fear. The gaslighting was perhaps worse than the physical violence. Marcus had a way of twisting every conversation, making Sarah question her own memory and sanity. When she'd confront him about his cruelty, he'd claim she was being dramatic, that she was imagining things, that perhaps she needed professional help for her delusions. He'd follow these accusations with elaborate apologies and expensive gifts, creating a cycle of abuse and false reconciliation that left Sarah emotionally shattered. Sarah's isolation became complete when Marcus fired their housekeeper Maria, who had become Sarah's only confidant in the house. Maria had worked for the Blackwell family for 15 years, and she'd seen enough to know what was happening to the young Mrs. Blackwell. The day Maria tried to slip Sarah the number for a domestic violence hotline, Marcus discovered the note. Maria was gone within the hour, and Marcus made sure Sarah understood that anyone who tried to help her would face serious consequences. For 2 years, Sarah endured this hell in paradise. 2 years of walking on eggshells, of measuring every word, of living in constant fear of triggering Marcus's explosive rage. She lost weight, stopped sleeping, and developed a nervous habit of touching the small scar above her left eyebrow, where Marcus had thrown a crystal vase that shattered against her face. The vibrant, joyful woman who had sold preserves at the farmer's market slowly disappeared, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who flinched at sudden movements. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just controlling Sarah. He wanted to break her completely, to strip away every last piece of her dignity and self-worth. The hot air balloon ride was supposed to be his masterpiece of psychological torture, a grand gesture that would demonstrate his absolute power over her life. He'd planned it for weeks, telling Sarah it was a romantic surprise for their second wedding anniversary. He'd even hired a photographer to capture their special moment, though Sarah would later realize the photos were meant to document something far more sinister than romance. The morning of the balloon ride, Sarah woke with a sense of dread she couldn't explain. Marcus was being unusually kind, bringing her breakfast in bed and telling her how much he loved her. But there was something in his eyes, a cold calculation that made her skin crawl. She'd learned to read his moods like a survival manual, and every instinct screamed that something terrible was coming. As they drove to the launch site in the Napa Valley, Marcus kept up a steady stream of conversation about their future together. He talked about the children they would have, the trips they would take, the life they would build. But his words felt like threats rather than promises, each one another link in the chain that bound her to him. Sarah stared out the window at the rolling vineyards and wondered if she would ever be free to enjoy simple beauty again without fear. The hot air balloon itself was magnificent, painted in deep blues and golds that caught the late afternoon sun. The pilot, a cheerful man named Tom who'd been flying balloons for 30 years, greeted them warmly and explained the safety procedures. Sarah noticed that Marcus had specifically requested a private flight, no other passengers, and had paid extra for Tom to give them space during the ride. At the time, she thought it was romantic. Later, she would understand it was strategic. As they lifted off from the valley floor, Sarah felt a momentary surge of wonder despite her anxiety. The world spread out below them like a living map, vineyards giving way to rolling hills and distant mountains. For a few precious minutes, floating silently through the sky, she almost forgot about Marcus's presence beside her. She almost remembered what it felt like to simply exist without fear. But Marcus was watching her, studying her face with that cold intensity she'd come to dread. He was waiting for something, though Sarah couldn't imagine what. The balloon drifted peacefully through the golden hour, and Tom called out landmarks from his position near the controls, giving the couple privacy in their corner of the basket. That's when it happened. Sarah, relaxed for perhaps the first time in months, felt her stomach rumble with hunger. They'd skipped lunch, and the champagne Marcus had insisted she drink was making her lightheaded. Without thinking, without the careful control she usually maintained around Marcus, her body betrayed her in the most human way possible. A small, embarrassing sound escaped her, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the balloon's fabric. Marcus's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. His face contorted with a rage so pure, so volcanic, that Sarah actually stepped backward in the basket. For a moment, the only sounds were the gentle roar of the burner and Tom's oblivious commentary about the sunset. Then Marcus spoke, his voice low and deadly. What happens next will shock you to your core, and it's exactly why Sarah's story has become a symbol of survival against impossible odds. "You disgusting pig," Marcus hissed, his voice dripping with venom that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. 2 years of marriage and you're still nothing but a filthy farm girl who can't even control herself in public. Sarah's face burned with shame and terror. She tried to stammer an apology, but Marcus wasn't finished. His eyes held that familiar look of cold calculation mixed with explosive rage. The same expression she'd seen before every beating, every cruel punishment he'd devised to remind her of her place. "I've given you everything," Marcus continued, his voice rising just enough that Tom glanced back nervously from his position at the controls. "Designer clothes? Jewelry worth more than your pathetic family will ever see? And this is how you repay me? By embarrassing me like some barnyard animal?" The balloon continued its peaceful drift through the evening sky, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in its basket. Below them, the Napa Valley stretched out in golden splendor, couples at wineries raising glasses to toast the sunset, families gathering for dinner, people living normal lives without fear. Sarah stared down at that peaceful world and felt like she was looking at a life she would never have. Marcus moved closer, and Sarah instinctively pressed herself against the wicker wall of the basket. She could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something darker, something that reminded her of all the nights she'd cowered in their bedroom while he raged about her inadequacies. Tom was still pointing out landmarks, completely unaware that his passengers were locked in a deadly dance of predator and prey. "You know what the problem is, Sarah?" Marcus asked, his tone suddenly conversational, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "I've been too patient with you, too understanding. I thought I could train you to be worthy of the Blackwell name, but you're just like a dog that can't be housebroken. Some animals are simply too damaged to fix." Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. She wanted to scream, to call out to Tom for help, but Marcus's hand moved to rest casually on the edge of the basket, and she knew with horrible certainty that any sound from her would make this situation infinitely worse. She'd learned to read his body language like a survival guide, and every signal screamed danger. "Please, Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle roar of the burner above them. "I'm sorry, it was an accident. I didn't mean to—" "Didn't mean to what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Didn't mean to show me exactly what kind of woman I married? Didn't mean to prove that no amount of money or training can make you anything more than trailer trash?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. 2 years of constant psychological warfare had worn down her defenses until she almost believed his twisted version of reality. Almost. But somewhere deep inside, in a place Marcus hadn't been able to reach, a small voice still whispered that this wasn't normal, that no one deserved to live like this. Tom called back to them cheerfully, "We'll be starting our descent soon, folks. Hope you've enjoyed the ride." Marcus smiled, but it was the cold, predatory smile Sarah had learned to fear more than his obvious rage. "Oh, we're about to enjoy it very much," he replied, loud enough for Tom to hear. Then, leaning close to Sarah so only she could catch his words, he whispered, "You want to act like an animal? Then you can die like one." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd seen Marcus angry countless times, had endured his fists and his cruelty, but she'd never seen this particular look in his eyes. This wasn't just rage anymore. This was something far more dangerous. This was the look of a man who had made a decision, who had crossed some internal line from which there was no return. "Marcus, what are you saying?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a breath. The basket swayed gently in the evening breeze, and she gripped the edge with white knuckles, suddenly aware of just how high they were, how far they had to fall. "I'm saying that accidents happen, darling," Marcus replied, his tone almost loving now, which made his words even more chilling. "Rich men lose their wives in tragic accidents all the time. Boating mishaps, car crashes, even hot air balloon disasters. The grieving widower always gets so much sympathy, especially when he donates generously to charities in his deceased wife's memory." Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't a spontaneous reaction to her embarrassing moment. This was planned. The private flight, the remote location, the careful timing. Marcus had orchestrated this entire evening not as a romantic gesture, but as an execution. Her execution. "You're insane," Sarah breathed, but even as she said it, she knew that wasn't true. Marcus wasn't insane. He was calculatingless. He'd planned, methodical, and absolutely ruthed this murder with the same cold precision he applied to his business dealings. "Am I?" Marcus asked, tilting his head like he was genuinely curious about her opinion. "Or am I simply a man who's tired of being embarrassed by his inferior wife? Do you have any idea what people say about us, Sarah? What they whisper at parties when they think I can't hear?" Sarah shook her head, tears starting to blur her vision. She didn't care what people said, she just wanted to live. She wanted to see another sunrise, to smell her grandmother's rose garden again, to hug her sister Emma just one more time. "They say I married beneath me," Marcus continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "They say you're nothing but a gold-digging farm girl who got lucky. They're not wrong, of course, but it reflects poorly on my judgment. I can't have that kind of reputation in my business circles." The balloon had begun its descent now, but they were still hundreds of feet above the ground. Tom was focused on his instruments, preparing for landing, trusting his passengers to remain safely in their corner of the basket. He had no idea that he was about to become an unwilling witness to murder. Marcus had pulled out what reached into his jacket looked like a small device. Sarah stared at it in confusion until she realized it was some kind of emergency locator beacon, the type used by hikers and sailors in distress. He clipped it to his belt with casual efficiency. "What is that?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Insurance," Marcus replied simply. "When they find my body tomorrow morning, battered but alive after my miraculous survival, this little device will show exactly where I was when the tragic accident occurred. The grieving husband who tried desperately to save his beloved wife, but couldn't quite reach her in time." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what Marcus was telling her. He wasn't planning to kill just her. He was planning to stage his own accident, to make it look like they'd both fallen, but only he had survived. The perfect crime with the perfect cover story and enough money to ensure that any investigation would conclude exactly what Marcus wanted it to conclude. "Please," Sarah whispered, hating how desperate she sounded, but unable to stop herself. "Marcus, please don't do this. I'll be better. I'll change. I'll do whatever you want." Marcus studied her face like he was memorizing it, and for one impossible moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that cold, calculating stare that had haunted her nightmares for 2 years. "You know what your problem is, Sarah," Marcus said, moving closer until she could feel his breath on her face. "You actually believed the fairy tale. You thought this was a love story instead of a business transaction. But every transaction has an expiration date, and yours just ran out. Tom's voice drifted back to them, cheerful and oblivious. Coming in for landing, folks. What a beautiful evening for flying. Marcus smiled one last time, and Sarah saw her own death reflected in his eyes. Yes, he called back to Tom. It certainly has been unforgettable. What happened next would haunt Tom's dreams for years to come, but it would also mark the beginning of the most extraordinary transformation anyone could imagine. Because sometimes, when evil thinks it has won completely, that's exactly when the universe decides to intervene. The basket was still swaying gently when Marcus made his move, lunging forward with the calculated precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. But in that split second, as Sarah stared into the face of her own death, something remarkable happened. Something that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless others who would hear her story in the years to come. The moment Marcus lunged toward her, time seemed to stretch like taffy. Sarah's survival instincts, dormant after years of abuse, suddenly exploded to life. She twisted away from his grasping hands, her body moving with desperate agility she didn't know she possessed. Marcus, expecting easy compliance from his broken wife, stumbled forward with too much momentum. What happened next defied every calculation in Marcus's meticulous plan. As he reached for Sarah, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipped on the basket's smooth floor. The emergency beacon he'd so carefully clipped to his belt caught on the wicker edge, and suddenly the predator became the prey. Marcus Blackwell, the man who had terrorized Sarah for 2 years, plummeted from the basket with a scream that cut through the evening air like belief as her tormentor fell ablade. Sarah watched in stunned dis toward the vineyard below, his body becoming smaller and smaller until it disappeared among the orderly rows of grapevines. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Tom's horrified shouts from the front of the basket. "Oh my God! Oh my God! What happened? Where's your husband?" The radio, his hands shaking as he tried to contact Tom, was frantically working ground control while simultaneously attempting to land the balloon safely. Sarah stood frozen, gripping the basket's edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Part of her couldn't believe what had just occurred. After 2 years of living in constant fear, after accepting that she would never escape Marcus's control, he was simply gone. Fallen from the sky like a broken angel, taking his cruelty with him. But even as the balloon touched down in an empty field, even as emergency vehicles began racing toward the vineyard where Marcus had landed, Sarah knew her nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning to transform into something entirely different. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Marcus had been right about one thing. His money and connections ensured that every detail of the incident would be scrutinized with microscopic intensity. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Sarah would die with him, taking the truth to her grave. Instead, she was very much alive, and for the first time in 2 years, she had nothing left to lose. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had seen her share of domestic violence cases, but there was something about Sarah Mitchell that haunted her long after their first interview. The young woman sat in the police station conference room like a ghost, her designer clothes hanging loose on her too thin frame, her eyes holding secrets that seemed to weigh more than her entire body. "Mrs. Blackwell," Detective Rodriguez said gently, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened in that balloon." Sarah stared at the coffee like she'd never seen such a thing before. For months afterward, she would remember this moment as the first time in years that someone had offered her something, without expecting payment in fear or submission. "He was going to kill me," Sarah whispered, her voice so soft that Detective Rodriguez had to lean forward to hear her. "He planned the whole thing. The private flight, the timing, everything. He even had an emergency beacon to make it look like he'd tried to save me." The detective's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Blackwell. Can you prove any of this?" That's when Sarah did something that surprised even herself. She smiled. Not the brittle, terrified smile she'd perfected during her marriage, but something genuine and fierce. "Actually, Detective Rodriguez, I think I can." What Sarah revealed over the next 6 hours would expose a web of corruption, abuse, and murder that reached far beyond one toxic marriage. Because Marcus hadn't just been planning to kill Sarah, She was simply the latest in a pattern that stretched back years, involving other women who had mysteriously disappeared after crossing the Blackwell family. Sarah had been documenting everything. Every beating, every threat, every suspicious phone call she'd overheard. While Marcus thought he was breaking her spirit, Sarah had been quietly gathering evidence, hiding it in places he would never think to look. She'd memorized account numbers whispered during late-night business calls. She'd photographed bruises with a hidden camera. She'd even managed to record several of Marcus's violent outbursts using an old phone she'd kept hidden in their bedroom. "You see, Detective," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Marcus made one fundamental mistake. He assumed I was as stupid as he told everyone I was. But farm girls from Iowa learn early how to be resourceful. We learn how to survive." The evidence Sarah provided didn't just incriminate Marcus in his planned murder of her. It exposed an entire criminal enterprise. The Blackwell family had been using their legitimate businesses to launder money for organized crime syndicates. They'd been bribing officials, intimidating witnesses, and yes, eliminating inconvenient wives who knew too much. Marcus's first wife, the beautiful socialite Catherine Blackwell, hadn't died in a boating accident as the newspapers had reported. She'd been murdered after threatening to expose the family's criminal connections. His second wife, Maria Elena, a former model from Argentina, hadn't overdosed on pills as her death certificate claimed. She'd been poisoned after discovering Marcus's offshore accounts. Sarah had stumbled onto this information gradually, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and suspicious documents she'd found in Marcus's private office. She'd realized that her own A Perfect cover story for Marcus's increasingly marriage wasn't about love or even possession. It was about creating violent tendencies while giving him access to her complete innocence as a shield. He needed a wife who looked wholesome and unthreatening, Sarah explained to the packed courtroom months later. Someone his business associates and criminal partners would never suspect of knowing anything important. He thought he could control me completely, use me as window dressing for his legitimate businesses while he continued his real work in the shadows. But Marcus had underestimated the quiet strength that comes from growing up on a farm, from learning that survival sometimes requires patience, observation, and the ability to endure until the moment comes to act. Sarah had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. The media circus that surrounded the case was unlike anything the legal system had seen in years. Here was a story that had everything: wealth, murder, domestic violence, and a heroine who had literally fallen from the sky to expose it all. Sarah's transformation from terrified victim to fearless witness captivated the entire country. But the real transformation was happening inside Sarah herself. For the first time since her wedding day, she was remembering who she had been before Marcus. The confident young woman who had run her own small business, who had made people smile with her homemade preserves, who had believed in the fundamental goodness of the world. The legal proceedings took 18 months, during which Sarah lived in protective custody while federal investigators dismantled the Blackwell criminal empire piece by piece. Every day brought new revelations, new arrests, new evidence of just how deep the corruption had spread. Marcus, meanwhile, had survived his fall from the balloon but with catastrophic injuries that left him paralyzed from the waist down and facing dozens of federal charges. His carefully constructed image as a successful businessman crumbled as investigators seized his assets, froze his accounts, and exposed his connections to organized crime families across 3 states. From his hospital bed, then later from his jail cell, Marcus watched his empire collapse while the woman he had tried to murder became the key witness in the largest organized crime prosecution in the state's history. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Sarah. "He spent 2 years trying to make me disappear," Sarah told reporters on the courthouse steps after Marcus's conviction. "Instead, he made me visible in ways he never could have imagined." The Blackwell case, as it came to be known, resulted in 43 convictions and the seizure of over $200 million in criminal assets. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments when she realized she could sleep through the night without fear, when she could laugh without calculating whether it might trigger someone's rage, when she could simply exist without constantly monitoring every word and gesture for signs of danger. The settlement from Marcus's estate made Sarah financially independent for life, but money had never been her goal. Instead, She used her newfound resources to establish the Catherine Maria Foundation, named after Marcus's previous victims. The foundation provided support services for domestic violence survivors and funded investigations into unsolved cases involving missing or murdered women. Sarah also returned to school, earning degrees in criminal justice and psychology. She wanted to understand not just how to escape abusive situations, but how to prevent them from happening in the first place. Her thesis on the intersection of domestic violence and organized crime became required reading in law enforcement training programs across the country. 5 years after the hot air balloon incident, Sarah stood before a congressional committee investigating the connections between domestic violence and organized crime. She wore a simple blue dress that reminded her of the Iowa sky, her hair pulled back in the same practical style she'd favored before her marriage to Marcus. But her eyes held a steely determination that would have been impossible to imagine in the terrified woman who had once cowered in a Malibu mansion. "Senators," Sarah began, her voice clear and unwavering, "domestic abuse isn't just a family problem. It's often the entry point for much larger criminal conspiracies. When we fail to take domestic violence seriously, when we treat it as a private matter between spouses, we're not just failing the victims. We're missing opportunities to expose and disrupt major criminal enterprises." The committee listened in rapt attention as Sarah outlined her recommendations for connecting domestic violence investigations with organized crime task forces. Her testimony would later be credited with helping to pass the Domestic Violence Criminal Enterprise Act, landmark legislation that provided new tools for prosecutors dealing with cases where intimate partner violence intersected with organized crime. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Sarah's transformation wasn't her public advocacy or her legal victories. It was the way she had learned to trust again, to open her heart to the possibility of genuine love after years of surviving its twisted counterfeit. She met David Chen at a trauma recovery conference where they were both speaking. David, a former FBI agent turned therapist, had specialized in helping law enforcement officers deal with the psychological aftermath of undercover work. He understood in ways that civilian therapists couldn't, what it meant to live with constant vigilance, to have your survival depend on reading subtle cues and hidden dangers. Their relationship developed slowly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding of trauma's long shadow. David never pushed Sarah to move faster than she was comfortable with, never demanded explanations for the moments when old fears would suddenly resurface. He simply provided steady, patient support while Sarah continued the long work of healing. Their wedding, when it finally happened, was everything Sarah's first wedding hadn't been. Intimate, genuine, and filled with people who truly cared about her happiness rather than her social status or financial value. Sarah's sister Emma served as maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched Sarah exchange vows with a man who looked at her like she was precious rather than possessed. The ceremony took place in the garden behind the farmhouse where Sarah had grown up, surrounded by her grandmother's heirloom tomato plants and the rolling Iowa fields that had shaped her character. It was a deliberate choice, a way of reclaiming the simple dreams that Marcus had tried to destroy. But even in her happiness, Sarah never forgot the women who hadn't been as fortunate as she had been. Catherine Blackwell, Maria Elenia Blackwell, and the dozens of other women whose stories had emerged during the investigation. Women who had loved the wrong man, who had trusted someone who saw them as disposable, who had died before they could expose the truth about their abusers. Sarah's foundation had grown into a national organization, with offices in 12 states and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. They had helped solve 43 cold cases involving missing or murdered women, many of them connected to organized crime families who had used domestic violence as both a tool of control and a method of elimination. The foundation also provided something that traditional domestic violence resources often couldn't: protection and support for women whose abusers had connections to organized crime or corrupt officials. Sarah understood from personal experience that sometimes escaping an abusive relationship required more than just a restraining order and a safe house. Sometimes it required the kind of resources and connections that could stand up to serious money and institutional corruption. On the 10th anniversary of the hot air balloon incident, Sarah stood once again in a courtroom, but this time she was there by choice. Marcus Blackwell, now serving multiple life sentences, had requested a meeting with her. His lawyers claimed he wanted to apologize, to make amends for the pain he had caused. Sarah had debated for months whether to accept the meeting. Part of her had no interest in seeing the man who had terrorized her, who had tried to murder her, who had destroyed so many other lives in his quest for power and control. But another part of her was curious about what the years in prison might have done to Marcus's carefully constructed facade. The man who was wheeled into the prison conference room bore little resemblance to the commanding figure who had once dominated Sarah's nightmares. Prison had aged Marcus dramatically, his once perfect appearance replaced by the gray pallor and hollow eyes of someone who had lost everything that mattered to him. The expensive suits had been replaced by prison orange. The manicured hands now bore the calluses of institutional labor. But when Marcus looked at Sarah, she saw that his eyes hadn't changed. They still held that cold calculation, that fundamental inability to see other people as fully human. Whatever words he might speak, whatever apologies he might offer, the essential Marcus remained unchanged. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice hoarse from years of limited use. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or transformation. She found none. "I came because I wanted to see what 10 years in prison had done to you," she replied calmly. "I wanted to know if you had learned anything about the consequences of treating other people as disposable." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him calculating his response, trying to determine what words might achieve whatever goal had motivated him to request this meeting. It was the same predatory assessment she remembered from their marriage, just filtered through the lens of his current powerlessness. "I've had a lot of time to think," Marcus finally said. "About what I did, about the choices I made, about the women who died because of those choices." "And?" Sarah prompted, her voice neutral. "And I realize now that I was wrong," Marcus continued. But there was something performative about his tone, as if he was reciting lines he had rehearsed. "I let my anger and my need for control destroy everything good in my life. I destroyed you. I destroyed my other wives. I destroyed my own future." Sarah felt a flash of the old fear, quickly followed by something much stronger. Contempt. After everything Marcus had done, after all the lives he had destroyed, he was still making it about himself, still positioning himself as the primary victim of his own choices. "You didn't destroy me, Marcus," Sarah said quietly. "You tried to, but you failed. And that failure taught me something important about the difference between surviving and thriving. You can't destroy someone who refuses to be broken." For the first time since she'd entered the room, Sarah saw a crack in Marcus's carefully controlled facade. A flash of the old rage, quickly suppressed but unmistakably there. He hadn't changed at all. He was simply trapped in a situation where his true nature couldn't find expression. Sarah stood up, their meeting clearly over in her mind. She had gotten what she came for. Confirmation that her decision to move forward with her life, rather than remaining trapped in the past, had been the right one. "I hope you find peace, Marcus," Sarah said as she gathered her purse. "But I'm not going to waste any more of my life waiting for you to become someone capable of genuine remorse. Some people change, and some people just get better at hiding what they really are." As Sarah walked out of the prison that day, she felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with Marcus's hollow words or performative regret. She had faced the monster who had tried to destroy her, and she had discovered that he no longer had any power over her emotions or her future. The fear that had controlled her for so many years was truly, finally gone. The drive back to her current home in Colorado gave Sarah time to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. From the terrified young woman who had been pushed from a hot air balloon to the confident advocate who now helped other survivors find their voices, the transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. But Sarah knew that transformation was always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Sometimes especially in the darkest circumstances. Because it was often when people had nothing left to lose that they discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. The real test of Sarah's transformation came not in courtrooms or congressional hearings, but in the quiet moments when she had to decide who she wanted to become. The woman who emerged from that prison meeting was fundamentally different from the one who had entered. She had looked evil in the face and discovered that it no longer held any power over her. But Sarah's story was far from over. In fact, the most important chapter was just beginning. 6 months after her final meeting with Marcus, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything once again. Detective Rodriguez, now retired but still working cold cases as a consultant, had discovered something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Sarah, I need you to sit down," Rodriguez said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We found another one, another victim, another woman whose life had been destroyed by the Blackwell criminal network. But this case was different. This woman was still alive, still trapped, still in desperate need of the kind of help that only someone like Sarah could provide. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she was married to Marcus's cousin, Richard Blackwell. Richard had inherited part of the family business after Marcus's conviction, and he had also inherited Marcus's taste for young, vulnerable women who could be isolated and controlled. Jennifer was 22 from a small town in Montana, and according to the intelligence Rodriguez had gathered, she was living in the same kind of nightmare Sarah had escaped. "The FBI has been building a case against Richard for months," Rodriguez explained during their meeting at a quiet cafe in downtown Denver. "Money laundering, racketeering, the usual family business. But they need someone on the inside, someone who can get close to Jennifer and convince her to cooperate." Sarah felt her chest tighten. The thought of deliberately inserting herself back into the world she had fought so hard to escape was terrifying. But the thought of another woman enduring what she had endured was worse. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Richard Blackwell is hosting a charity gala next month," Rodriguez said, sliding a photograph across the table. "All the usual suspects will be there. Old family friends, business associates, people from Marcus's old social circle. You still have connections in that world, Sarah. You could get invited." Sarah stared at the photograph of Richard Blackwell. He looked remarkably like Marcus. The same cold eyes, the same predatory smile that had once haunted her dreams. Seeing his face brought back memories she had worked years to process and overcome. "You want me to go back?" Sarah said quietly. "You want me to walk back into that world and pretend to be someone I'm not?" "I want you to be exactly who you are," Rodriguez corrected. "The woman who survived Marcus Blackwell and helped bring down his entire organization. The woman who has dedicated her life to helping other survivors. You're the only person who truly understands what Jennifer is going through, and more importantly, you're the only person she might trust enough to accept help from." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. Everything in her life had been moving forward, away from the darkness of her past. Her marriage to David was strong and healing. Her foundation was thriving. She had built a new identity based on helping others from a safe distance, not by throwing herself back into danger. But that night, as Sarah lay in bed next to David, she couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer Walsh. Somewhere in the country, a young woman was living the same nightmare Sarah had escaped. She was probably lying awake at that very moment, wondering if she would survive another day, wondering if anyone would ever come to help her. "You're thinking about taking the case," David said quietly in the darkness. He knew her well enough to read the tension in her body, the way she held herself when she was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Am I that obvious?" Sarah asked, turning to face him. "Only to someone who loves you," David replied, reaching out to touch her face gently. "Talk to me. What's going through your head?" Sarah spent the next hour explaining everything Rodriguez had told her about Jennifer Walsh and Richard Blackwell. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "It's dangerous," David said finally. "These people tried to kill you once. Going back into their world, even for a good cause, puts you at enormous risk." "I know," Sarah admitted. "But David, what if no one had been willing to take risks for me? What if Detective Rodriguez hadn't pushed the investigation? What if the prosecutors hadn't been willing to take on such a powerful family? I might still be trapped in that mansion, or more likely, I'd be dead." David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him struggling between his desire to protect her and his understanding of who she had become. The woman he had married wasn't someone who could turn her back on another person's suffering, especially when she had the unique ability to help. "What do you need from me?" David asked finally, and Sarah felt a surge of love for this man, who understood that supporting her sometimes meant letting her walk into danger. "I need you to trust that I'm strong enough to do this," Sarah said, "and I need you to be my anchor. If I'm going to go back into that world, I need to know that you'll be here when I come out." The preparation for Sarah's return to high society took weeks of careful planning. The FBI provided her with a new identity, complete with a backstory that would explain her presence in Richard Blackwell's social circle. She would be Sarah Chen now, the widow of a wealthy tech entrepreneur, someone with enough money and connections to warrant an invitation to exclusive events. But the hardest part wasn't learning her cover story or memorizing the details of her fake identity. The hardest part was preparing emotionally for what she would face. Sarah had spent years healing from the trauma Marcus had inflicted, building a life based on safety and genuine relationships. Now she had to deliberately return to a world where every interaction was calculated, where danger lurked behind every smile. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the trauma specialist Sarah had worked with for years, helped her develop strategies for maintaining her emotional equilibrium during the operation. "Remember," Dr. Hendricks said during one of their sessions, "you're not the same person who was victimized by Marcus. You have skills now, knowledge, support systems. You're going in as a survivor, not as a victim." Sarah practiced her cover story until it became second nature. She studied photographs of Richard Blackwell and his associates, memorizing faces and relationships. She even took refresher courses in the kind of sophisticated social behaviors that would be expected at high-end charity events. But the most important preparation was psychological. Sarah had to find a way to access the part of herself that had survived 2 years of abuse without allowing that experience to overwhelm her current strength and confidence. The night before the charity gala, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the elegant black dress she would wear to the event. It was beautiful, expensive, exactly the kind of outfit that would help her blend in with Richard Blackwell's social circle. But looking at herself in designer clothes brought back memories of all the times Marcus had used fashion as another tool of control. "You look beautiful," David said from the doorway, but Sarah could hear the worry in his voice. "I look like someone I used to be," Sarah replied, turning away from the mirror. "Someone I never want to be again." "Then don't be her," David said, moving to stand behind her. "Be yourself. Be the woman who built a foundation that has helped hundreds of survivors. Be the woman who testified before Congress. Be the woman who looked Marcus Blackwell in the eye and told him he hadn't destroyed you." Sarah leaned back against David's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. Tomorrow she would walk back into a world that had nearly killed her, but she wouldn't be walking in alone. She carried with her the love of a good man, the support of law enforcement professionals who believed in justice, and most importantly, the knowledge that she had survived the worst these people could do to her. The charity gala was held at the Blackwell family estate in Napa Valley, the same region where Marcus had tried to murder her 10 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as her car wound through the familiar landscape, past the vineyards where Marcus's body had fallen, toward the mansion where his cousin now continued the family tradition of cruelty disguised as respectability. The estate was even more opulent than Marcus's Malibu home had been. Fountains and sculptures dotted perfectly manicured grounds, while the mansion itself sprawled across several acres like a monument to excess. Valets in crisp uniforms directed guests toward the main entrance where the soft glow of chandeliers promised an evening of refined elegance. Sarah took a deep breath as her car joined the line of luxury vehicles approaching the main entrance. Somewhere inside that beautiful mansion, Jennifer Walsh was playing the role of the perfect wife, just as Sarah had once done. The thought gave her strength and purpose. The moment Sarah stepped out of her car, she was back in character. Sarah Chen, wealthy widow, philanthropist, someone with enough social standing to warrant inclusion in this exclusive gathering. She moved through the crowd with the practiced grace that had been beaten into her during her marriage to Marcus, smiling at the right moments, making appropriate small talk, all while scanning for her real targets. She spotted Jennifer Walsh within minutes. The young woman was standing beside Richard Blackwell near the main bar, her posture perfect, her smile radiant, her eyes completely dead. Sarah recognized that look immediately. It was the same expression she had worn to countless social events during her marriage to Marcus, the mask of the perfect wife, hiding the reality of daily terror. Jennifer was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs Rodriguez had shown Sarah. Tall and willowy with strawberry blonde hair and green eyes, she looked like she should be gracing magazine covers instead of enduring the kind of systematic abuse Sarah knew she was suffering. But Sarah could see the subtle signs that others would miss. the way Jennifer flinched slightly when Richard touched her arm, the careful way she monitored his expressions, always ready to adjust her behavior to avoid triggering his anger. Richard Blackwell himself was everything Sarah had expected and worse. He had Marcus's same predatory confidence, the same sense of entitlement that came from a lifetime of having unlimited money and power. When he looked at the other guests, Sarah could see him calculating their worth, their usefulness, their potential threat level. "Sarah Chen, isn't it?" a voice said behind her, and Sarah turned to find herself face to face with a woman she recognized from her research. Patricia Blackwell, Richard's sister who served as the family's primary liaison with their legitimate business interests. "Yes," Sarah replied, extending her hand with the confident smile she had perfected. "Patricia Blackwell, I presume? Thank you so much for including me tonight. The cause is certainly worthy." They made polite conversation for several minutes, Patricia clearly fishing for information about Sarah's background and connections. Sarah provided just enough detail to seem authentic while deflecting the more probing questions with practiced ease. But even as she navigated the social minefield, Sarah's attention remained focused on Jennifer Walsh. The young woman had moved away from Richard and was now standing alone near a window overlooking the gardens, her expression distant and melancholy. This was Sarah's chance. She excused herself from Patricia and made her way across the room, timing her approach to look casual and spontaneous. "Beautiful gardens," Sarah said, coming to stand beside Jennifer at the window. "I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Sarah Chen." Jennifer turned, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something hopeful in her eyes before the careful mask reasserted itself. "Jennifer Walsh," she replied. "Well, Jennifer Blackwell now, I suppose. I'm still getting used to the new name." "How long have you been married?" Sarah asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. 8 months, Jennifer replied, and Sarah caught the slight tremor in her voice. "It feels like longer sometimes." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 8 months. Jennifer was still in the early stages of what Sarah knew would only get worse if nothing was done to help her. The isolation, the psychological manipulation, the gradual erosion of self-worth that preceded the physical violence. "Marriage takes adjustment," Sarah said carefully, testing the waters. "Especially when you're joining a family with such strong traditions and expectations." Jennifer's laugh was brittle and hollow. "Strong traditions? Yes, that's one way to put it." She glanced around nervously, clearly checking Todd wasn't within earshot. Make sure Richard Sarah felt her heart racing. This was the opening she had been hoping for, the chance to establish a connection that might eventually lead to trust. But she had to be incredibly careful. One wrong word, one suspicious phrase, and Jennifer might retreat behind her protective walls permanently. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," Sarah said, sticking to her cover story, but infusing it with genuine emotion. "Before he died, he told me something that I've never forgotten. He said that the people who truly love us want us to be happy, not perfect. They want us to feel safe, not grateful." Jennifer's eyes widened slightly, and Sarah could see that the words had hit their target. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and Sarah saw the frightened young woman underneath. "That sounds like he was a good man," Jennifer said quietly. "He was," Sarah replied. "He taught me that love shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells. It should feel like coming home." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Sarah could see Jennifer processing her words, comparing them to her own experience, perhaps remembering what it had felt like to be with someone who didn't require constant vigilance and perfect behavior. "Jennifer!" Richard's voice cut across the room like a whip crack, and both women turned to see him approaching, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you are, darling. I've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah watched as Jennifer's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her shoulders tensed, her smile became more forced, and she moved slightly away from Sarah as if proximity to another woman might somehow be interpreted as disloyalty or defiance. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen," Jennifer said, her voice now carefully modulated to show the proper level of deference. "Sarah, this is my husband, Richard Blackwell." Richard extended his hand to Sarah, and she had to suppress a shudder of revulsion as his fingers closed around hers. His grip was firm to the point of being painful, a subtle display of dominance that Sarah remembered all too well from her own marriage. "Mrs. Chen," Richard said, his eyes scanning her face with predatory interest. "I don't believe we've met before. Are you new to the area?" "I've been traveling extensively since my husband passed," Sarah replied smoothly. "I'm just now starting to establish connections in California again. Your wife was kind enough to introduce herself." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, and Sarah realized he was calculating whether her presence represented a threat or an opportunity. She could almost see him weighing her potential usefulness against the risk of allowing his wife to form connections with other women. "I'm sorry for your loss," Richard said, though his tone suggested anything but sympathy. "What line of work was your husband in?" Sarah spent the next few minutes providing carefully rehearsed details about her fictional late husband's tech company, all while observing the dynamic between Richard and Jennifer. The young woman stood slightly behind her husband, her posture deferential, her eyes carefully neutral. But Sarah caught the way Jennifer's hands trembled slightly, the way she seemed to be holding her breath waiting for Richard's approval of this unexpected social interaction. "Well, it was lovely meeting you, Mrs. Chen," Richard said finally, his tone suggesting the conversation was over whether Sarah was ready or not. "Jennifer, darling, there are some people I'd like you to meet." He placed his hand on Jennifer's lower back with what looked like gentle guidance, but which Sarah recognized as a controlling grip. Jennifer's smile never wavered, but Sarah saw the flash of resignation in her eyes. "It was wonderful talking with you, Sarah," Jennifer said, and for just a moment she met Sarah's eyes directly. "I hope we'll have the chance to continue our conversation sometime." The words were simple, polite, exactly what anyone would expect from a well-bred young woman at a social gathering. But Sarah heard the deeper message, the desperate hope that someone somewhere might understand what she was going through. As Richard led Jennifer away, Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest. Not the helpless fury of a victim, but the focused anger of someone who had the power and knowledge to fight back. She watched them disappear into the crowd, noting the way Richard's hand never left Jennifer's back, the way he guided her movements with subtle pressure and control. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of careful social maneuvering. Sarah collected business cards, made appropriate donations to the evening's charity, and gradually built her cover identity as someone worth knowing in this rarefied social circle. But her real focus remained on Jennifer Walsh, on finding ways to establish the kind of connection that might eventually lead to trust and escape. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing on the mansion's terrace, looking out over the same Napa Valley landscape where her own nightmare had ended 10 years earlier. The irony was almost overwhelming. She had returned to the scene of her near murder not as a victim, but as a rescuer. "Quite a view, isn't it?" a voice said behind her, and Sarah turned to find Jennifer approaching alone. The young woman looked around nervously before joining Sarah at the terrace railing. "It's beautiful," Sarah agreed, "and peaceful. Sometimes I think peace is the most underrated luxury in the world." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit vineyards. "Do you really think that?" she asked finally. "That love should feel like coming home?" Sarah's heart clenched. This was the moment she had been working toward all evening, the chance to plant a seed that might eventually grow into the courage Jennifer would need to save herself. "I know it should," Sarah said gently. "I spent years in a marriage where I never felt safe, where I was constantly afraid of saying the wrong thing or making the wrong move. I thought that was normal. I thought that was what love looked like when you weren't good enough to deserve better." Jennifer's breath caught, and Sarah could see tears gathering in her eyes. "How did you know?" she whispered. "How did you know what it was like?" "Because I lived it," Sarah replied simply, "and because I survived it, and because I want you to know that you can survive it too." The sound of footsteps on the terrace made both women turn, and Sarah felt her blood chill as Richard Blackwell appeared in the doorway. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he took in the scene. "There you are, Jennifer," Richard said, his voice pleasant but with an undertone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to. It's time we were heading home." Jennifer straightened immediately, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind her practiced mask. "Of course," she said. "I was just getting some air." But as Richard approached, Sarah saw him glance meaningfully at her, and she realized with growing alarm that he might have overheard more of their conversation than she had hoped. The way his hand settled on Jennifer's shoulder was possessive and threatening, and Sarah could see the fear flickering in the younger woman's eyes. "Mrs. Chen," Richard said, including Sarah in his cold smile. "Thank you for keeping my wife company. Jennifer sometimes gets overwhelmed at these large gatherings. She's still adjusting to our social obligations." The words were perfectly polite, but Sarah heard the warning underneath. Richard was letting her know that he was aware of her interest in Jennifer, and that he would be watching for any further attempts at connection. "It was my pleasure," Sarah replied smoothly. "Jennifer is delightful company. I hope we'll have the chance to meet again soon." "I'm sure our paths will cross," Richard said, though his tone suggested he would do everything in his power to ensure they didn't. "Good evening, Mrs. Chen." As Sarah watched them walk away, she saw Richard lean down to whisper something in Jennifer's ear. The young woman's shoulders tensed, and Sarah knew that whatever he was saying was a warning about their conversation, a reminder of the consequences of forming unauthorized friendships. But Sarah also knew that she had succeeded in planting the most important seed of all. Jennifer Walsh now knew that someone understood her situation, someone who had survived similar circumstances and lived to fight another day. The connection had been made, fragile and dangerous as it was. The drive back to her hotel gave Sarah time to process what she had learned during the evening. Jennifer was clearly in the early stages of an abusive relationship that followed the same pattern Sarah remembered from her own marriage. The isolation, the psychological manipulation, the constant monitoring and control. But there was also something different, something that gave Sarah hope. Jennifer still had fight in her. Despite months of systematic abuse, she hadn't yet reached the point of complete surrender that Sarah remembered from her own darkest days. There was still time to reach her, still time to provide the support and resources she would need to escape. But Sarah also knew that time was running out. Richard Blackwell was clearly suspicious of her interest in his wife, and he would be taking steps to ensure that no further contact was possible. If Sarah was going to help Jennifer, she would need to act quickly and carefully. Back in her hotel room, Sarah called Detective Rodriguez to report on the evening's events. The conversation was brief and professional, but Sarah could hear the satisfaction in Rodriguez's voice when she described her interaction with Jennifer. "She's ready to listen," Sarah concluded. "But Richard is suspicious. We're going to have to be very careful about how we approach this next." "Agreed," Rodriguez replied. "But Sarah, you did good work tonight. You made contact, established trust, and gathered intelligence about their relationship dynamic. That's more than we could have hoped for in a single evening." After ending the call, Sarah sat on her hotel bed, still wearing the elegant dress that had helped her blend into Richard Blackwell's world. But now, alone in the quiet room, she felt the full weight of what she had committed to. She was once again involved in a deadly game with people who had no qualms about eliminating threats to their power and control. The difference was that this time, Sarah wasn't playing as a victim. She was playing as someone who understood the rules, someone who had survived the worst these people could do, someone who had built a life and identity strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. As she prepared for bed, Sarah thought about Jennifer Walsh, probably lying awake in her own bed, wondering if the conversation on the terrace had been real, or if she had imagined finding someone who understood her situation. Sarah hoped that Jennifer would hold on to that moment of connection, would remember that survival and escape were possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to help a young woman break free from the same kind of nightmare that had once threatened to destroy Sarah's own life. The stakes couldn't be higher, but Sarah had never been more ready for the fight ahead. The foundation Sarah had built over the past decade became the secret weapon in her mission to save Jennifer Walsh. While Richard Blackwell thought he was dealing with a wealthy widow looking to expand her social circle, he was actually facing an organization with resources that rivaled law enforcement agencies. Sarah's team included former FBI agents, private investigators, trauma counselors, and most importantly, survivors who understood exactly what Jennifer was experiencing. Dr. Amanda Torres, a forensic psychologist who specialized in domestic violence cases, worked with Sarah to develop a psychological profile of Richard Blackwell based on his behavior at the charity gala. Their analysis revealed patterns that were both familiar and terrifying. Richard was following the exact same playbook that Marcus had used, but with refinements that made him even more dangerous. He's learned from Marcus's mistakes, Dr. Torres explained during a secure video conference with Sarah and Detective Rodriguez. Marcus was impulsive, driven by rage and a need for immediate gratification. Richard is more calculated, more patient. He's building his control gradually, making Jennifer complicit in her own isolation. The evidence supported this assessment. Sarah's investigators had discovered that Richard had systematically eliminated Jennifer's support network over the 8 months of their marriage. Her college friends had been alienated through a series of carefully orchestrated social incidents. Her family in Montana had been convinced that Jennifer was too busy with her new life to maintain regular contact. Even her job at a local art gallery had been eliminated when Richard made a generous donation to the gallery in exchange for them letting Jennifer go. He's creating a perfect victim, Sarah realized with growing urgency. Someone who has nowhere to turn when the physical abuse starts, because Sarah knew it would start. The pattern was always the same. First came the isolation, then the psychological manipulation, then the gradual escalation to physical violence. Jennifer was currently somewhere in the middle of this progression, which meant they had a narrow window of opportunity to intervene before she became another casualty of the Blackwell family's cruelty. Sarah's next move required delicate timing and perfect execution. She arranged to run into Jennifer at a high-end spa in Napa Valley, a place where wealthy women went to relax and socialize away from their husbands' watchful eyes. The encounter had to appear completely coincidental while providing Sarah with an opportunity to deepen their connection. The Serenity Springs Spa was exactly the kind of place Sarah expected to find someone like Jennifer seeking temporary escape. Nestled in the hills above St. Helena, it catered to women who had everything money could buy except peace of mind. Sarah arrived early, positioning herself in the relaxation lounge where she could observe other guests without appearing to be waiting for anyone specific. Jennifer arrived alone, which surprised Sarah until she realized that Richard probably encouraged these solo outings. They gave him plausible deniability while allowing him to monitor Jennifer's activities through credit card receipts and location tracking on her phone. The young woman looked even more fragile than she had at the charity gala, her designer workout clothes unable to disguise the weight loss that spoke of stress and anxiety. Sarah waited until Jennifer had settled into a lounge chair with a cup of herbal tea before approaching. "Jennifer, what a pleasant surprise. I was hoping I might run into you again." The relief that flooded Jennifer's face confirmed what Sarah had suspected. The young woman was desperately lonely, cut off from meaningful human connection by her husband's systematic campaign of isolation. "Sarah, hi," Jennifer said, her voice brightening for the first time since Sarah had known her. "I'm so glad to see you. I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala." They spent the next hour in what appeared to be casual conversation, but was actually a carefully choreographed intelligence-gathering operation. Sarah learned that Richard monitored Jennifer's phone calls and text messages, controlled their social calendar, and had recently begun making comments about Jennifer's appearance and intelligence that were designed to erode her self-confidence. "He says I'm not very bright," Jennifer confided, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That I embarrass him in front of his business associates. I've been trying so hard to be better, to learn about his work, to say the right things at parties. But nothing I do seems to be enough." Sarah felt her heart breaking for this young woman who was living the same nightmare she had once endured. The gaslighting, the impossible standards, the constant message that she was fundamentally inadequate and should be grateful that someone like Richard was willing to tolerate her presence. "Jennifer," Sarah said gently, "has anyone ever told you that you're intelligent and capable exactly as you are?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse Jennifer, as if the concept was foreign to her. "I mean, before Richard, maybe, but he knows about these things. He went to Harvard Business School. He understands how the world works." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jennifer was already so deep in the psychological manipulation that she was questioning her own basic worth and intelligence. This was exactly where Sarah had been during the worst days of her marriage to Marcus, when she had started to believe that his cruelty was somehow justified by her own inadequacy. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah asked, leaning forward slightly. "My late husband used to say that the most dangerous lie we can tell ourselves is that someone else's opinion of us is more accurate than our own self-knowledge. He said that when people try to convince us we're less than we are, it's usually because they need us to be smaller to feel bigger themselves." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, processing Sarah's words. "But what if they're right? What if I really am as useless as Richard says?" "Then why did he marry you?" Sarah asked simply. "If you're truly as worthless as he claims, why would a successful, intelligent man like Richard choose to spend his life with you? Either he's lying about your worth, or he's admitting that his judgment is so poor he married someone he considers beneath him. Which explanation makes more sense to you?" The logic was simple but powerful, and Sarah could see it working its way through Jennifer's carefully conditioned thought patterns. For the first time, the young woman was being asked to consider that her husband's constant criticism might not be objective truth but rather a tool of control. Their conversation was interrupted by Jennifer's phone buzzing with a text message. Sarah watched as the young woman's entire demeanor changed, her face going pale as she read whatever Richard had sent. "I have to go," Jennifer said, gathering her things with shaking hands. "Richard is expecting me home for lunch, and I'm already running late." Sarah could see the fear in Jennifer's eyes, the same terror she remembered feeling whenever she had kept Marcus waiting. Time was running out faster than Sarah had hoped. Richard was clearly escalating his control, and the window for intervention was closing rapidly. "Jennifer, wait," Sarah said, making a decision that could either save Jennifer's life or put them both in mortal danger. "I need to tell you something important about your husband's family." Jennifer paused, torn between her desperate need to avoid Richard's anger and her curiosity about what Sarah might reveal. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. "Richard's cousin Marcus was my first husband. I know exactly what you're going through because I'd lived it myself." The words hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She stared at Sarah in shock, her mind clearly racing as she processed this revelation. "You're Marcus's wife, but he said you died in an accident. And he tried to kill me," Sarah said simply. "He pushed me out of a hot air balloon because I embarrassed him. But I survived, and I helped send him to prison for life. Richard is following the same pattern Marcus did. The isolation, the psychological abuse, the gradual destruction of your self-worth. If you stay with him, he will eventually try to kill you too." Jennifer's phone buzzed again, more urgently this time. "I can't," she whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I can't deal with this right now. I have to go home. Richard will be so angry if I'm late." "Jennifer, listen to me," Sarah said urgently. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. But I want you to know that when you're ready, when you decide you want out, I can help you. I have resources, protection, a way to disappear that even Richard won't be able to trace." Jennifer looked at Sarah with a mixture of hope and terror. "You really survived, Marcus? You really got away?" "I did more than survive," Sarah said firmly. "I built a life that's everything he tried to prevent me from having. Love, purpose, peace, safety. All the things he told me I didn't deserve." "You deserve them too, Jennifer. You deserve so much more than what Richard is giving you." The young woman nodded frantically, wiping tears from her cheeks as she headed toward the exit. "I have to think about this. I need time to process what you've told me." "Take all the time you need," Sarah called after her. "But remember, I'm here when you're ready." Sarah watched Jennifer rush toward the parking lot, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had just set events in motion that could go in any number of dangerous directions. By revealing her true identity, she had given Jennifer the information she needed to make an informed decision about her future. But she had also created a situation where Richard might discover that his wife had been in contact with the woman who had destroyed his cousin's life. The drive back to her hotel gave Sarah time to consider her next moves. She called Detective Rodriguez immediately, knowing that the investigation would need to accelerate now that her cover was potentially compromised. "You did the right thing," Rodriguez assured her after hearing about the conversation at the spa. Jennifer needed to know who she was really dealing with. But you're right that this changes everything. Richard is going to be suspicious of any further contact between you two, which means we need to be ready to move fast when Jennifer decides she wants out, Sarah replied. Because if Richard figures out who I really am before she makes that decision, we might not get another chance. The next 48 hours were among the longest of Sarah's life. She remained in her hotel, maintaining her cover as Sarah Chen, while her team prepared for multiple scenarios. If Jennifer decided to stay with Richard, they would need to find another way to build a case against him. If she decided to leave, they would need to execute a complex extraction operation that could keep her safe from Richard's inevitable retaliation. But if Richard discovered Sarah's true identity before Jennifer made her choice, they might be facing something much worse than a rescue operation. They might be facing another murder attempt. The call came at 3 in the morning. Sarah's secure phone rang with the tone that meant emergency contact, and she answered immediately despite being pulled from deep sleep. "Sarah, it's Jennifer." The young woman's voice was barely above a whisper, thick with tears and terror. "Something's happened. Richard knows who you are." Sarah was instantly awake, her mind shifting into crisis mode. "Where are you calling from? Are you safe?" "I'm locked in the bathroom," Jennifer whispered. "Richard found some old newspaper articles about Marcus's trial. He saw your picture, recognized you from the gala. He's been screaming at me for hours, demanding to know what you told me, whether I've been talking to the police." Sarah's blood ran cold. This was the scenario they had hoped to avoid, the one where Jennifer became the target of Richard's rage before they could get her to safety. "Jennifer, listen to me very carefully. Do you have your car keys? Can you get out of the house without Richard seeing you?" "I don't know," Jennifer sobbed. "He took my phone, my keys, everything. I'm using the landline in the bathroom, but I don't know how long before he breaks down the door." Sarah was already getting dressed, signaling to the FBI agent stationed in the hotel hallway. "We're coming to get you. Can you make it to the front gate of your property?" "Maybe. If I can get past Richard. But Sarah, he has a gun. He showed it to me, said he knows how to make problems disappear just like Marcus did." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in horror. Jennifer was trapped in a house with a man who had just threatened to kill her, and Sarah was 20 minutes away under the best circumstances. 20 minutes that might be 19 minutes too long. What happened next would determine whether Sarah's mission to save Jennifer Walsh would end in triumph or tragedy. And somewhere in Napa Valley, a young woman was fighting for her life against a man who had learned that the most effective way to control someone completely was to convince them they had no choice but to stay. The race against time had begun, and Sarah knew that everything she had built, everything she had learned, everything she had survived would be tested in the next few hours. Jennifer Walsh's life hung in the balance, and Sarah was the only person who truly understood what the young woman was facing. And she wasn't going in defenseless. This time, she had an army of survivors this time. Sarah wasn't going in alone. Behind her, and they were all determined that Jennifer Walsh would not become another victim of the Blackwell family's legacy of violence. The nightmare was far from over, but neither was the fight. The FBI tactical team was already mobilized when Sarah's phone went dead. Detective Rodriguez had anticipated this scenario, positioning agents strategically around the Blackwell estate the moment Sarah revealed her true identity to Jennifer. But 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours when someone's life was hanging by a thread. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Through her earpiece, she could hear the tactical commander coordinating with local law enforcement, but the words seemed to come from very far away. All she could think about was Jennifer Walsh, trapped in that bathroom, waiting for help that might arrive too late. "We're getting thermal imaging from the drone," Agent Martinez reported from the passenger seat. "2 heat signatures in the main house. 1 stationary in what appears to be a second-floor bathroom, 1 moving back and forth in the hallway outside." Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the layout of the Blackwell estate from her reconnaissance. The master suite was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens where she and Jennifer had first made their connection. Now those same beautiful grounds would serve as the backdrop for what could be Jennifer's final moments. "How long since the last phone contact?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. 17 minutes, Rodriguez replied grimly. "Sarah, I need you to understand that when we go in, your job is to stay with the support team. You're not law enforcement, and you're not trained for tactical operations. Sarah nodded, but they both knew she would do whatever was necessary to save Jennifer. She had walked into that charity gala knowing it might cost her life. She wasn't about to let bureaucratic protocol stop her from finishing what she had started. The convoy turned through the gates of the Blackwell estate, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The mansion looked different now, no longer the elegant venue for sophisticated social gatherings, but a fortress where a woman was fighting for her survival against a man who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Agent Martinez's radio crackled to life. Thermal shows the mobile signature has stopped moving. Both targets are now in the same room. Sarah felt her heart stop. Either Richard had broken down the bathroom door, or Jennifer had been forced to come out. Neither possibility offered any comfort. The tactical team moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the house while maintaining radio silence. Sarah watched from the command vehicle as black-clad figures took positions at every exit, every window, every possible escape route. These were professionals who had done this hundreds of times before, but Sarah knew that Richard Blackwell wasn't like other domestic violence perpetrators. He had money, connections, and most importantly, he had nothing left to lose. "We're going to try to establish communication first," the tactical commander explained to Sarah. "If we can get him talking, maybe we can de-escalate the situation before anyone gets hurt." Sarah wanted to scream that Richard Blackwell wasn't someone who could be reasoned with, that every second they spent trying to negotiate was another second Jennifer was in mortal danger. But she forced herself to stay quiet, to trust in the expertise of people who did this for a living. The phone in the master bedroom rang 6 times before Richard answered. His voice, when it came through the speakers in the command vehicle, was calm and controlled, nothing like the rage-filled monster Jennifer had described. "I assume this is about my wife," Richard said, as if he was discussing the weather. "I'm afraid she's indisposed at the moment. Mr. Blackwell, this is Agent Carson with the FBI. We'd like to talk to you about resolving this situation peacefully. Is Jennifer all right?" Richard's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Jennifer is exactly where she belongs. She's learning about the consequences of betraying her family, just like every Blackwell woman eventually learns." Sarah felt ice forming in her veins. Richard wasn't just threatening Jennifer. He was claiming her as property, asserting ownership in the same way Marcus had done with her. The psychological profile Dr. Torres had developed was proving horrifyingly accurate. "We know about your family's history, Richard," Agent Carson continued, his voice remaining professionally calm, despite the implications of what he was hearing. "We know about Marcus, about the other women who died. It doesn't have to end the same way for Jennifer." "Other women?" Richard's tone sharpened with interest. "You mean like Sarah Mitchell? The little farm girl who thought she could destroy a family that's been building power for 3 generations?" Sarah grabbed the radio microphone before anyone could stop her. "This is Sarah Mitchell, Richard. The little farm girl who sent your cousin to prison for life. The one who exposed your entire criminal organization and destroyed everything Marcus built." The silence that followed stretched for almost 30 seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice had changed completely, the careful control replaced by something much more dangerous. "Well, well, the famous survivor herself. I have to admit, Sarah, I'm impressed. It takes real courage to walk back into the lion's den after barely escaping with your life the first time." "Let Jennifer go, Richard. This is between you and me now. She doesn't have anything to do with what happened to Marcus." "Oh, but she does," Richard replied, his tone almost conversational. "You see, Jennifer made a choice when she started talking to you. She chose to betray her husband, her family, her vows. And in the Blackwell family, that kind of betrayal has consequences." Sarah could hear movement in the background, muffled sounds that made her blood run cold. "What are you doing to her, Richard? I'm teaching her the same lesson Marcus should have taught you. Some women are too stupid, they have. Some women need to appreciate what to learn respect the hard way." Agent Carson took back the microphone, his professional composure finally cracking slightly. "Richard, you need to understand that this house is completely surrounded. There's no way out. The best thing you can do for yourself and Jennifer is to end this peacefully." "End this peacefully?" Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. "Agent Carson, I think you misunderstand the situation. I'm not trying to escape. I'm trying to finish what my cousin started. Sarah Mitchell destroyed my family, cost us hundreds of millions of dollars, sent Marcus to rot in prison. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This had never been about Jennifer Walsh. Richard had been planning this from the moment he learned about Sarah's survival. The young woman trapped upstairs wasn't just a victim of domestic violence. She was bait in a trap that had been 3 years in the making. You married Jennifer to get to me. Sarah breathed into the microphone. I married Jennifer because she fit the profile perfectly, Richard confirmed. Young, isolated, vulnerable, exactly the type of woman you'd risk everything to save. I've been studying you, Sarah. Your foundation, your rescue operations, your pathological need to save every damaged bird with a broken wing. I knew that if I created the right circumstances, you'd come running. The tactical team was already moving, abandoning any pretense of negotiation. Richard Blackwell had just admitted to a conspiracy that went far beyond domestic violence. He had orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot that had put multiple lives at risk, and he was clearly prepared to see it through to its bloody conclusion. Sarah ripped off her headset and ran toward the house before anyone could stop her. She could hear Rodriguez and Agent Martinez shouting behind her, could see the tactical team preparing to breach the front door, but none of that mattered. Jennifer Walsh was upstairs with a psychopath who had spent 3 years planning Sarah's destruction, and every second counted. The front door exploded inward just as Sarah reached the foyer. Tactical officers flooded through the opening, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp with commands. But Sarah was already running up the grand staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time, driven by the desperate knowledge that she might already be too late. The master bedroom door was standing open, and Sarah could see immediately that the room was empty. But she could hear voices coming from the attached bathroom, Richard's calm tease. Sarah Honey's alternating with Jennifer's terrified peel, pressed herself against the wall beside the bathroom door, trying to assess the situation without revealing her presence. You know what I find fascinating about your friend Sarah? Richard was saying, his voice conversational despite the circumstances. She actually believes she won something when Marcus fell out of that balloon. She thinks she defeated him, escaped his control, built some kind of meaningful life. Jennifer's response was barely audible, but Sarah could hear the terror in her whispered words. Please, Richard, I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know who she was when we met. Of course you didn't, Richard replied, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. That's what made you perfect for this. Your genuine innocence, your authentic fear, your desperate need for rescue. Sarah couldn't resist you any more than a moth can resist a flame. Sarah realized with growing horror that Richard was using Jennifer as a psychological weapon, forcing the young woman to understand that her suffering had been orchestrated from the very beginning. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond physical violence into something much darker. The tactical team was moving through the house systematically, but Sarah couldn't wait for them to reach the second floor. She could hear the change in Richard's tone, the shift from philosophical monologue to something more immediate and dangerous. The beautiful thing about revenge, Richard continued, is that it's so much sweeter when it's served with the side of irony. Sarah thought she was saving you, Jennifer. Instead, she was walking into the same trap that killed Marcus's other wives. History repeating itself with a few improvements based on lessons learned. Sarah made her decision. She stepped into the bathroom doorway, her hands raised to show she was unarmed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Hello, Richard. You wanted me here, and here I am. Let Jennifer go. Sarah's story proves that sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. From that terrifying night in a hot air balloon to building a foundation that has saved countless lives, she transformed unimaginable trauma into unstoppable purpose. Jennifer Walsh is alive today because one woman refused to let evil win twice. Remember, if you or someone you know needs help, resources are available. Sometimes the most ordinary people become extraordinary heroes when they decide that enough is enough,